What's going on, guys, and welcome back to the YouTube channel. So it's been a while since I have done a training programming walkthrough video for you guys, so I wanted to go ahead and get one of those knocked out. The session that you are about to watch is my legs B session, which is without a doubt my hardest training session in my entire training program. If you guys follow and watch my Instagram and TikTok content, you'll be familiar with the fact that I openly talk about how I'm not very good at RDLs and split squats, and I have both of those exercises programmed on this session. And so this one is a real difficult session for me, not only in terms of the amount of fatigue that it generates, but also the amount of mental preparation and execution that I have to do in the session. I really feel like I have to be 100% focused on what I'm doing, or I really can easily mess up these movements. This is my second leg day in the week. I have a more quad dominant one earlier in the week where I do a squatting pattern for my heavy compound, and in this one I do the RDLs and a hip hinge. I also do a squatting pattern in this exercise. Obviously the split squats is a single leg squat, but it isn't as much of a fatigue causing exercise as something like a hack squat or a leg press is. So this session is probably my more hamstring and posterior chain dominant leg day of the two. Okay, enough rambling, let's get into the session. As always, guys, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them as a comment and I will get back to you as soon as I can. I get a lot of good, interesting training, programming feedback in my comments on these type of videos, and I really look forward to seeing more of that. So it wouldn't be one of my training sessions if the first exercise had absolutely nothing to do with the overall theme of the session, would it? It probably seems like this is a common theme in all of my sessions now. I do some back work before push days. I do some delt and bicep work before leg days, and I've kind of talked about this a lot on my channels. I don't really want to talk about it too much in this particular video, but this leg day is another instance where I am using it as an opportunity for me to top up on an additional body part. In this particular instance, it is biceps. Now, the day after this, I am training a push session, so that is why I would not do delt frequency on this particular session, because it would just affect the delt work that I did the next day. So I'm doing biceps in this one. My exercise of choice is this bilateral cable curl. It's one of the very few curling exercises that I can do bilaterally with both arms that doesn't cause elbow or wrist pain. I find the other one to be the easy curl bar, believe it or not. Even though that one does not have a lot of flexibility at the wrist, I still feel like I can get a good traction out of both of those. I am working in two different rep ranges for the curls. My first set aiming to fail somewhere in the 8 to 12 rep range, something on the lower end. And then my second set, I'm trying to hit something a little lighter, something in the 13, 14, or 15 range, and even up as high as 20 reps. You know, there may be times where I build that second set up into a 20 repper before I increase the weight, just depending on how the logbook has been moving at that time. Once the fluffy accessory stuff is out of the way, it's time to get into the actual leg movements. So I prefer to start my leg days off with my calf raises for a couple reasons. The most important ones being I find I am much stronger on my calf training when I do it at the beginning rather than the end. And I also find that I'm able to give a lot more effort and hit true failure on it when I have the most energy at the beginning of the session. I do not find that it impacts my squat patterns at all, so that is of no concern to me. And then also I like using my calf raises as an opportunity to kind of warm up my feet and ankles. So I've talked about this a couple times on all of my channels, but I played football, American football, for like 8 years, and I never really had any serious injuries, but I did have more ankle rolls and twisted ankles than I could possibly ever imagine. So I really have terrible ankle mobility. And so for me, doing the calf raises at the beginning is also part of helping me improve my functional movement. I find that it helps get my calves warmed up and my feet warmed up so that I can be more stable in rooting my feet into the floor for all of my exercises. And I find that it just helps warm up my entire lower leg so that I can be more assertive on all of my major compound movements. I like to do both the standing and the seated calf raise in the same session, just so I am hitting all parts of the lower leg and not really excluding anything. I don't think that this is the only way to program it. I think you can have one day where you do all your standing work and another day where you do all of your seated work, and I think you're probably going to get very similar results. But I just like to do both in the same session. Just I feel like it ticks off some more boxes for me, and I feel like it just really is helping me getting warmed up. Like I mentioned, that is a really integral part of the calf raises for me, is how it preps my lower body and my lower legs to be able to squat and hinge effectively. The last thing that I'll touch on the calf training is, if you notice the tempos that I'm using on the various exercises, they match the strength curve of the calves as they fatigue. So at the beginning, when the calves are fresh, I am spending a much longer period of time at peak contraction. And then on my second exercise, as the muscles become more fatigued, I spend less time at peak contraction and more time in the stretch. This is just going to help match the fatigue levels of the calves, and all muscles along those lines. When a muscle is fresh, I really like to emphasize getting it short, and then as it becomes more fatigued and more difficult to get short, I like to spend more time in the stretch, because there's going to be more oomph left in that portion of the range of motion. Moving on from the calves, I get into the seated leg curl. So I'm doing 2 working sets here. My first one, trying to aim to fail in the 8 to 12 rep range, and I am using a 3 count pause on all of these reps. And then my second set is going to be non-paused reps, and I'm trying to do something a little bit lighter and higher reps, again going into that 15 to 20 rep range very often. So my thought process on the paused reps is very similar to the calf training that I just explained. While my hamstrings are fresh, I like to emphasize getting them short and then spending an exaggerated amount of time in that shortened position so that I can really fatigue that area, especially on this particular seated leg curl where peak tension occurs at the shortened position. And so I really like to take advantage of that by incorporating some paused reps. And then as the muscles get more fatigued and they get harder and harder to get short, I transition into lighter load, higher rep work where I start to do 15s and 20s, because then the fact that the tension occurs at the shortened position doesn't become as much of a factor, because we're doing so many total reps and the load is so comparatively lighter to what it would have been on the heavier set, that it just makes it a little bit easier to progress those back off sets. So for those of you guys who use exercises like this or a hammer strength or things along those lines, and you notice that that second set that really emphasizes the shortened position gets more and more difficult to progress, I highly recommend working in some very high rep ranges and giving yourself more opportunities to actually get the muscle short on those exercises where it's harder to get them short naturally. After 2 hard sets on the seated leg curl, my hamstrings are absolutely pumped up, and it's time to finish them off by putting them through a full stretch. My preferred way of doing that right now is with a barbell RDL. So as I mentioned at the beginning in the intro clip, this is an exercise that I really struggle with. This is actually an exercise that caused me a pretty significant lower back injury when I first started lifting probably 4 to 5 years ago, and I have had a really tough mental block on this exercise ever since, and I've made a lot of excuses to myself as to why this was an exercise that I couldn't do or shouldn't do, but over the course of the past 3 or 4 months, I have really been holding myself accountable to doing this exercise on a weekly basis and focusing on slowly improving both my execution and my actual performance in terms of load and reps. I'm kind of getting into a point where I'm doing my RDLs the best that I have ever done them, and it's really just kind of a fatigue management perspective at this point. I know that sounds ridiculous for somebody that's doing RDLs with less than 2.5 plates. There are tons of people out there who are doing RDLs with 4 and 5 plates, but I am, in my opinion, very skilled at the execution of this movement right now. I just find that hard to translate into sheer strength overload, and so I'm not really forcing that as much as I am enforcing good technique and just making sure that I don't increase my load and reps too quickly to the point where I can no longer safely execute reps and potentially hurt my lower back again. Even though this is a hamstring dominant session, that doesn't mean that I don't do any quad work, and I'm actually really trying to improve my quads on my physique specifically. So quads are a very integral part of this session for me, even though it is quote unquote hamstring dominant. So after I do the RDLs, I'm really done with my posterior chain work for this session, and it's time to move on to the quad stuff. And the leg extension is the perfect transitional movement for me between my hinge pattern and my squat pattern, because it gives my lower back an opportunity to rest, and it also warms up my quads and knees so that I can recruit them effectively in my squat pattern. I will do 2 working sets on the leg extension, again working in 2 different rep ranges. So while the quads are strong, I like to load them heavy with something in the 8 to 12 rep range, and then I like to pump them full of blood with something in the 15 to 20 for the back off set. The dumbbell split squat is my squat pattern of choice for this session for 2 reasons. One, it does not load my lower back as much as something like a hack or a leg press or a barbell squat would, and because of that lower back injury that I mentioned that I suffered when I first started training, I find that my lower back is pretty fragile, and I need to just be conscious of how many exercises I use within 1 week in order to load my lower back. And so I don't like to use multiple lower back spinal loaded movements within the same session if I can avoid it. And the other reason is because this exercise is going to help improve my functional movement. So when I assess my left to right ability to stand on one leg, I really struggle to stand on my right leg and maintain balance there. And I also have a lot of injuries in my right knee and my right hip and my right glute. And I think that there is absolutely no coincidence for that. That obviously highlights that I have some movement deficiencies in my right leg. And so part of this exercise is to help address that and improve that so that I can be stronger at my 2-legged squat patterns. That is going to be the final exercise for this session. At this point, I am just completely spent and I have absolutely nothing left. The thing that sucks about my program at this point is I always do this session on Thursday, and then I have to do push on Friday morning. So Thursday night for me is a pretty short night. I pretty much go home, watch some TV and chill out, and then I have a very early morning on Friday to hit push. 1 working set here, and that's all she wrote. Time to go home and recover.